This is Siena, a wonderfully preserved medieval city in central Italy. At its heyday, around 1300, it was one of the most civilized and prosperous places in Europe. Siena and the other Italian city-states of its time, like Florence, can stand as a new beginning in our story of Western art. Hitherto, the old medieval worldview had, put simply, divided the classes of society into the aristocracy at the top, the church, and the laboring peasantry at the bottom. But in places like this, we see for the first time in European history a new class, conscious of its own identity, the merchants. These cities were no longer controlled by feudal lords. They were republics. Here in Siena, several thousand citizens were eligible for election to the governing bodies, which met down there in the Palazzo Pubblico. And in the Palazzo, there is a fresco painted in the 1340s, which encapsulates their faith in the secular arts of government, in the moderating power of reason in human society. It's called The Effects of Good Government. This marvelous fresco, painted by Ambrogio Lorenzetti, was the first panoramic landscape on this scale in Western art. The peasants bringing their produce from the countryside, the merchants going about their business, the elegant ladies of leisure, all are fused into an idealized image of the well-governed city-state. Eight years later, the Black Death devastated Siena. It killed the artist Lorenzetti and half the population of Europe. It was the greatest catastrophe in the modern history of the West, but surprisingly, for some regions, the plague was a springboard for economic growth. For the survivors, there were new opportunities. Florence recovered particularly quickly. By 1400, this was the city-state that dominated central Italy. The bankers and textile merchants were expanding their trading empires all over Europe. Over the next 100 years, an extraordinary interaction took place in Florence. The innovations of artists and architects, the excitement of rediscovering classical achievements, and the patronage of a wealthy commercial class. These key elements brought about a series of artistic and intellectual breakthroughs that came to be known as the Renaissance, literally the rebirth of learning and culture. In the church of Santa Croce, a series of frescoes painted around 1320 were to have a revolutionary effect on Florentine painting. Here, the great merchant families competed with one another to commission the leading artists to decorate their chapels. In the chapel of the Bardi family, Professor John White of University College London describes how these medieval images came to life.
This is a Franciscan church, and the Franciscans were the passionate preachers of the late medieval world. They used their words to tug at the emotions of the faithful, rich and poor alike. And at the same time, the painters increasingly tried to bring the Gospels and the stories of the saints to life before their very eyes. At first, as you can see in this late 13th century St. Francis altarpiece, they did it with stiff, imposing figures and with bright, doll-like symbolic scenes and images. And here next door, in a much ruined fresco, I'm afraid, painted probably only 30 or 40 years later, you can see the revolution represented by the art of Giotto, the great contemporary of the poet Dante. Here is a new, soft, warm reality, a new humanity and pathos, a new ability to take the faithful back and make them feel that they were actually there and filled with love for this loving saint whose love of Christ and love of life and of the beauties of the world wrought a transformation in the spiritual life of Europe.
Giotto's frescoes gave a new sense of weight to the human body, a new sense of urgency to narrative painting. They became an academy for later Italian artists. Raphael and Michelangelo came here to learn from such dramatic images as this, in which St. Francis receives the wounds of Christ upon his hands and feet.
Giotto's frescoes brought him immortality and undying fame to the chapel of the Bardi. They and families like them were moneylenders to the popes and kings of Europe. They were the pioneers of the new world of international finance, and the coinage of Florence, the gold florin, became the common currency of Christendom. Even John the Baptist, the saint of the desert and the enemy of luxury, is depicted surrounded by gold florins on the cover of a book containing the rules of the coin makers. But if the prosperity of Florence was owed to the bankers, the rebirth of its intellectual energy came from a rediscovery of classical culture.
Without ever leaving Santa Croce, we can move into the world of the Renaissance with this tomb of Leonardo Bruni, longtime Chancellor of Florence, who died in 1444. This was the Florence of the humanists, the students of the classics, of the knowledge and the wisdom of the ancient world. They went right back to the origins of Western thought in the great Greek philosophers. He also wrote a history of Florence, starting with Roman times. And in this great work, he put historical writing also onto a new footing, both in terms of its literary content and its scholarly underpinning. And there he lies, his history on his breast, surrounded by a wealth of classical detail, his bier supported by the Roman eagles, and his hope of heaven in the roundel of the Virgin and Child above his head. This monument in itself is a wordless combination of the Christian and the classical.